Chapter 10. Baptiste, Louisiana, July 13th. Even after dark it was sweltering hot. Sometimes the gators stayed down in the cool mud of the bayou for hours after nightfall, unless they were being fed. Baptiste was a tiny little town in the middle of nowhere. It had a small school and a general store, though, and the houses were more than shacks, though the townspeople did get most of their food from the bayou. But the nearest post office was 15 miles away in Catahoula, the nearest doctor as well. Not counting gators, there were 218 living residents of Baptiste, and 27 dead ones. Only the old-timers could remember when the vampires had first come to the swamp town. For most of them, things had simply always been that way, with the largest homes at the edge of town occupied by dead men and women, shuttered up tight during the day. There were stories, of course. Legends about people from Baptiste who had tried to burn them out, or just tried to leave town with their families still breathing. Nobody even whispered about such things after dark, and even when the sun was out, it was never more than talk. Not now. For the stories always ended the same, ended with death and bloodshed that had been unnecessary. The people of Baptiste led good lives, considering. There were only a handful of rules. First, obey. Second, do not speak of the undead outside of the town. And finally, do not ever try to leave. In the early years, supposedly, many had tried to flee. Each night they were hunted and brought back to die in front of their families and neighbors. Soon enough, people stopped trying to run. As long as everyone followed the rules, the people of Baptiste were safe, for the vampires did not hunt in the town. That was their cardinal rule. Their master would not allow it. In fact, the farther from Baptiste they hunted, the happier he was. It was a good life, in this way, ironically safe, for the people of Baptiste knew what lurked out there in the shadows. They lived with it every day, and they were protected from it. Kakistos protected them. An ancient vampire, he had come to the Louisiana swamps to escape the spread of the virus called humanity. It seemed to be infecting the whole world. Kakistos wanted to return to simpler times, to hunting and feasting and inspiring abject terror in human souls. In Baptiste, he had everything he wanted, and he knew he would be content to stay there forever. As such, he was fiercely protective of his territory. With the heat at last beginning to dissipate, he sat in a chair behind the enormous plantation house he had forced his humans to build for him, and looked out over the swamp to the bayou beyond. It had taken the people of Baptiste 7 years to build a house without anyone in the inside world any wiser. It was grand, and not merely by the standards of such poor humans. "My lord Kakistos." He looked up. The vampiress before him was beautiful, her red hair falling all the way to her waist. The dress she wore was little more than a shift, and it filled him with a great lust to see her like that. His hoof-like feet clicked together as he sat forward to admire her. "Alana, isn't it?" he asked. The vampire girl smiled. "There's entertainment available if you want it, sir," she informed him in the lilting accent of the area. She was a local girl, he recalled. He had found her in Lafayette and turned her himself. So taken with her had he been. But that had been a long time ago, and it was easy for him to forget. "What is it tonight?" "Young lovers from the city. Their car broke down, sir, so we offered them our special brand of southern hospitality. The gators are awfully hungry, sir." Kakistos smiled. "You make me proud, Alana. Have I told you that?" "You surely have, sir. You surely have," the girl replied and smiled, her fangs showing. "Before we bring the entertainment up from the pit, sir, we have guests. Visitors who want to beg a boon from y'all." "I don't like visitors," Kakistos said, scowling. The so-called visitors appeared behind Alana with no more introduction than that. Surely they had been told to wait. "We won't take up much of your time," said the male. "I'm Spike. Me lady love here's Drusilla. We're on a bit of a mission, see? But we heard right off when we came down here that this is your territory, and we weren't about to operate our little business transaction on your hunting grounds without your permission." Kakistos studied them. He did not like the male, Spike. Not at all. He swaggered with arrogance, fairly burned with the energy of it. But the female, Drusilla. Even as he examined her, she smiled and batted her lashes coquettishly at him. Her hands moved like serpents in front of her, and yet she seemed almost unaware of them. She swayed as she moved closer to him. "Spike's a bit rude, he is," she said, her voice low and soothing. She smiled suggestively. "He left out the most important bit. We've brought you a tribute, Kakistos. Juicy and rare. Twin boys, only 13. A single soul split into two, and the way the colors bend for them when they scream, and the clouds boil. They'll be quite a delicacy. I can promise you that." Kakistos smiled at Drusilla, reached out and stroked her cheek. She rubbed against his hand and purred like a kitten. Her lover bristled, but spoke not a word. He glanced at Alana. "The tribute?" "As precious as she says," the girl confirmed. "The sweetest, pinkest young ones." "Still," the ancient vampire grumbled. "Left something out," Spike said almost offhandedly. "Might help make up your mind. Girl we want, she's over in Lafayette. She's got a watcher training her. Kakisto stiffened. This was something else entirely. He attempted to hide how deeply this news disturbed him and failed. He wanted nothing to disrupt the paradise he had created for himself. A slayer? He asked. Spike pursed his lips and tilted his head first to one side, then the other. Not yet, he said slowly. But you know what they say about weeds. Gotta kill them before they grow. I will take your tribute, Kakisto said sternly, but without hesitation. You may hunt your girl, but I don't like you, Spike. It would be wise for you not to return to this part of the world in the future. The blonde vampire glanced around at the swamp and shrugged disdainfully. Oh yeah, sure. It'll break my bleeding heart, but you're the boss around here, eh? Not to worry. Kakistos narrowed his eyes and glared at Spike. Was the Britisher mocking him and the world he had built? He could not be certain. Before he could inquire further, Alana drifted before him in her flowing gossamer dress and smiled. Something tells me you're going to want those twins first, she said, a gleam in her eye. Yes. Let's see how they fare against my dear ones, Kakistos murmured. Spike and Drusilla had gone their way, but it no longer mattered. The arrogant one was out of his sight, and the problem of a potential slayer in the area would be eliminated. Kakistos' thoughts had turned to a far more important matter, feeding his pets. Baton Rouge, Louisiana, July 15th. The train sat motionless in the station at Baton Rouge, just as it had for more than 2 hours as repairs were made to the engine. It had been another long, sweltering day, the heat flirting with the 100-degree mark all afternoon. While repairs were made, the passengers were encouraged to get off the train and go to a nearby restaurant to have a bite to eat, maybe a glass of lemonade. Only a fool would have stayed on board the train in that brutal heat. The air was stagnant, no wind at all, and the windows on board the train weren't very big to begin with. Now, though, the sky was bleached white as the sun fell on the horizon. Dusk was fast approaching, and the conductor had still not rung the bell that would have indicated the train was ready to depart. No matter, they could not wait any longer. It's going to be hot, Bertram Martin complained. Yes, the Slayer replied. Yes, it is. Eleanor Boudreau studied Sophie with a curiosity and awe she had never felt before, not even at the movie palace. The Danish girl was only a year older than she herself was, but Sophie was at least 5 inches taller, and so beautiful that being near her made Eleanor painfully self-conscious. There was also the devastating fact that Sophie was a Slayer. For a multitude of reasons, this unnerved Eleanor profoundly. They walked toward the train, and the four of them boarded a rear car. Miss Narvik, Sophie's watcher, was first, followed by Eleanor and Bertram, her own watcher. Or he would be, someday, if she was ever chosen. Sophie stood aside as the three of them went up into the train. Only then did the Slayer follow. Inside their compartment, despite the heat, Miss Narvik closed and locked the door. They opened the window, but there was a little breeze, and Eleanor was already sweating profusely. Within the compartment, it was at least 15 degrees hotter than outside, but Eleanor knew better than to complain. Sophie and Yenna were there to protect her, after all. The way Bertram had explained it, only their timely arrival had saved her life. Other girls, other Slayers in waiting as they called them, had been horribly murdered already. Why me? Eleanor asked herself that question, but did not have an answer. It did not make sense. Not that she wished the older girl ill, but Sophie was a Slayer. It simply made no sense to Eleanor that anyone would want to kill her not for what she was, but for what she might one day become. One day. They sat in silence in the stifling compartment, and Eleanor studied Sophie closely. There was a pain in her heart and a sick feeling in her stomach that had nothing to do with the heat, but she could find no real explanation for it. Yenna, Bertram began, clearing his throat, I understand the need for precautions, but must we suffer in this sweatbox? Surely your scheme will be enough to throw these killers off. They're only vampires, after all. Not terribly bright, are they? The Slayer and her watcher had taken a ship to New Orleans before making their way up to Lafayette and locating Eleanor. They did not think it was safe to return by the same route, so they were taking a train east from Baton Rouge to Charleston, South Carolina, from which they would sail to England. It isn't my scheme, Miss Narvik replied. It is Sophie's. Should you ever be watcher to the chosen one, Bertram, you will eventually find that it becomes difficult to instruct them. Generally, the Slayer's instincts are best. Bertram blinked and turned to Sophie, as if to reiterate his question. The Slayer gazed at him firmly. Mr. Martin, she said, if you had read the reports about the activities of these vampires, you would not underestimate them. It may be uncomfortable in this car, but the sun is down, and it's better for us to be here together than out there in the dark. Suddenly, Sophie shifted in her seat and peered at Eleanor. The young girl shied away, eyes downcast, deeply uncomfortable. Eleanor, you have been staring at me since this morning when we first met. Is there something you need? Something I can help with? You have questions? Very tentatively, Eleanor lifted her gaze and brushed her long black hair away from her face. Sophie watched her intently. The Slayer had such grim features, such cold eyes, that Eleanor almost could not bring herself to speak. When Bertram spoke her name, the word turned into a question. He was concerned for her. "No?" Sophie pried. Eleanor swallowed hard. "Are y'all afraid?" she asked. Sophie blinked in surprise. "That was not one of the questions I thought you would have. Of course I'm afraid, though maybe not as afraid as I should be. So far these vampires have not come after me. I imagine that means that they are merely saving me for last. Once all the candidates who might replace me have been eliminated, they are sure to come after me." With a shake of her head, Eleanor leaned forward on her seat to study Sophie even more intently. The Slayer also leaned forward, until the two girls nearly bridged the floor of the compartment between them. "I don't mean just afraid of the vampires who are hunting us. I mean more than that. Just, are you afraid to be the Slayer? 'Cause I am," Eleanor confessed. Bertram seemed startled, but she ignored him. The only opinion that mattered now was Sophie's. "Here I am, being trained to replace y'all when you die. If I'm next to be chosen, that is. But you're so nice to me, protecting me, even though just being around me's gotta be a constant reminder of how short Slayers' lives usually are." "Eleanor!" Bertram scolded her. Yenna only watched Sophie expectantly. For her part, the Slayer looked stricken, even a bit pale. She closed her eyes a moment, then got up and moved across the compartment to sit beside Eleanor. "Yes, I'm afraid," she said again, though this time they both knew she was talking about something else. "It is hard to look at you and know that in some ways you represent my death. On the other hand, you are one of many. You are in far greater danger than I, at the moment." A tiny smile played at the corners of Sophie's mouth. "There's also the fact that I do not plan to die." Eleanor could not help laughing, and the distance that she had felt separating her from Sophie evaporated in an instant. In that same moment, the bell was rung to call the passengers back to the train. Less than 15 minutes later, the whistle blew and steam hissed and the engine screeched as it hauled its coaches and freight cars out of the station. At last, with the motion of the train, a breeze poured into the compartment and they all felt some relief. Outside the window, night had fallen. The lights of Lafayette disappeared quickly, and then there was only blackness, save for the occasional railroad signal. The two girls sat more closely together, and Bertram moved to the other side of the compartment to sit beside Yenna. As the watchers conversed anxiously about the war in Europe and their own battle against the vampires, the girls got to know each other. Eleanor had grown up with just her mother in Lafayette, and the idea that Sophie was an orphan from a place as distant and exotic as Denmark was amazing to her. To Eleanor, Denmark could be visited only in the pages of Hamlet. Their bags were on the rack overhead. Sophie stood and went through them, then produced for Eleanor's wide-eyed admiration a sword that had been in her family for centuries, and which the Slayer had received from her own father. Its scabbard was decorated, and the blade itself was inscribed with designs and words in a language Eleanor assumed was Danish. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers along the flat of the blade. "And sharp," Sophie told her. "Be careful." "You use this in battle?" Eleanor asked, amazed. "I do." The young girl shot a nasty look at Bertram. "I haven't been trained to use a sword." Bertram cleared his throat, looked nervously at Yenna, then sat up a bit straighter. "Though decapitation is perfectly acceptable as a means of destroying vampires, and demons as well, facility with a sword is far lower on the scale of priorities than, for instance, the use of the stake or crossbow, or expertise in simple hand-to-hand combat. The stake is a crude, but far more reliable weapon under most circumstances when it comes to vampires. You will be trained in swordsmanship, Eleanor, but all things in time, eh?" With a small grunt of disapproval, Yenna looked at Bertram. "Sophie knew how to use a sword even before I was assigned to her. It was her chosen weapon because it means a great deal to her, and in her hands there is no more efficient weapon." "All well and good for her," Bertram replied snappishly. "But I say again, all things in time." The watchers continued to speak, but a new coolness had developed between them, and Eleanor felt responsible. She sighed. Bertram had trained her well in the 14 months they had had together thus far. She had learned proficiency with a number of weapons, but she did not have the supernatural gifts of the Slayer. Nor did she have the natural confidence that Sophie simply exuded, the swagger the other girls seemed to have been born with. It made her realize something. Despite the fact that the Council of Watchers had identified her as a potential inheritor to the mantle of the Chosen One, Eleanor did not believe it for a moment. Nor had she ever, if she allowed herself to peek into her own secret heart. She was not the Slayer. She never would be the Slayer. "Sophie," she said, leaning against the older girl, to whom she felt bonded in some way, "tell me about being the Slayer. I want to hear. About your life and the things you've done, the battles you fought." The Slayer stiffened slightly and then relaxed and allowed Eleanor to lean against her. When she began to speak about an ancient vampire king named Gorm, Sophie seemed almost embarrassed by Eleanor's open admiration. Later, as Sophie talked about the war in France, Eleanor drifted off to sleep. Sophie was dimly aware of the rhythm of the train rattling along the tracks. It was the staccato beat of her own heart, and the promise of a journey to safety. It was a comfort to her even as she slept sprawled across one of the seats in the train compartment, with Eleanor leaning heavily against her, also asleep. They breathed as one, and Sophie had one arm across the other girl's back as though they were sisters, just small girls overcome by a long day's travel. From time to time the whistle blew. When the train switched tracks at a junction, each coach would shudder through the change. Sophie's scabbard sword was tucked partially beneath her sleeping form. They were scheduled to make a stop in Montgomery, Alabama. 70 miles outside of Montgomery, the train switched tracks again, and their coach was jostled so violently that the sword slipped from beneath its owner and clattered onto the floor of the compartment. Sophie snapped awake. It was dark in their compartment, but she could see well enough by the starlight coming through the window. Eleanor still slept heavily upon her. Across from them, she could see Yenna sitting primly upright, leaning against the wall of the compartment, also asleep. Bertram was gone. "Damn it!" Sophie hissed. Eleanor moaned in her sleep and squirmed, attempting to get comfortable in an inherently uncomfortable spot. With a grimace, Sophie slid out from beside the other girl and settled her down flat on the seat. She would wake Eleanor if it became necessary. It was possible Bertram had merely gone to relieve himself. The scabbard of her sword did not seem to have been damaged, but she put off more than a cursory examination until after she had confirmed Bertram's safety. Sophie crouched beside her sleeping watcher, her back to the window so she could see the door. "Yenna," she whispered harshly, and poked at the woman's knees. The watcher's eyes fluttered and then settled so that they were opened barely a crack. "Sophie? What is something wrong?" "Where's Bertram?" Sophie demanded. "Bert?" Yenna murmured. Then her eyes opened wide, her gaze darting around the darkened compartment. "Oh no," she muttered in Danish. "We agreed to sleep in turns, so that one of us would always be awake. You don't think he might have gone out just to—" "That was my thought," Sophie told her, eyes still on the door as she fastened the scabbard to her belt. "But he would have waked you, wouldn't he?" "Should have," Yenna agreed. Sophie cursed in a low voice. Since the moment she had woken, she had listened carefully to each sound that reached her ears. The rattling of the coach, the rhythm of the train upon its tracks, the whistling of the wind. That was all. The coach was completely silent otherwise. Relenting, she reached across the compartment to shake Eleanor awake. The younger girl blinked sleepily, and then, when she had focused and seen an expression on Sophie's face, she sat up quickly. "Where's Bertram?" she demanded. Sophie was blunt. "We don't know. Find weapons. Stakes if possible. It's too close in here for crossbows." She stared at Eleanor a moment, trying to think of something to say to calm the other girl, but then decided that perhaps that was not for the best. Instead, she turned back to Yenna to find her watcher staring at her expectantly. So there it was. The Slayer had felt their roles reversing, felt herself becoming the leader, but the altered nature of her relationship with Yenna crystallized in that moment. Sophie had always imagined that one day she would take charge of herself, of her destiny and her mission, and Yenna would become more advisor than teacher, but never had it occurred to her that this might happen not because she was ready to do so, but because Yenna was no longer fully capable of guiding her. Sophie glared at Yenna, angry in spite of her love for the woman. "Lock the door. Stay here. Protect her." With that, Sophie went to the door and opened it. It was not locked, of course, for Bertram would not have been able to lock it behind him. She paused a moment in the passageway outside the compartment until she heard Yenna bolt the door behind her. The passageway was dimly lit by electric lights that flickered with every rattle of the train. No one else was about, but Sophie moved silently and cautiously along the row of compartment doors until she came to the rear of the coach. She tested the door into the next cart and found it unlocked. The Slayer frowned. There was no room for error here, no second chances. Sophie snapped the knob off the door. Nobody would be able to come into the coach from that direction without her hearing them. With a deep breath, she stared down the long passageway at the opposite door. To her left there were only windows, looking out at the night. All of the compartments were on her right. She went to the first of the compartments and held up her fist to rap on the door. No, she thought. No warning. It would be easier to apologize for barging in than to suffer the consequences should she warn her enemies of her presence. The blade of her sword hissed against the scabbard as she freed it. Then she reached for the handle. The door was unlocked. Sophie hauled it open and went in, sword at the ready, heart hammering in her chest. The elderly couple who lay on either side of the compartment looked as though they might be sleeping, save for the odd angle of their necks and the fact that they did not so much as flinch at her intrusion. Sophie steadied her breathing as she glanced around the compartment. Once certain no one else was within, she turned her back upon the dead and quickly returned to the passageway so that she could not be surprised from behind. So they are here, she thought grimly. The time has come. The second compartment was completely empty. In the third were a pair of middle-aged men who, by their dress, she identified as traveling on business. They had been killed just as silently as the elderly couple, though the men had been bitten, their blood drained. The killers had painted a smiling face in the window in the dead man's blood. Sophie swallowed hard and held her breath a moment. This was not what she was used to. Vampires did not usually behave like this. They were brutal, yes, but their savagery was obvious and swift. Even Gorham, who had been her nemesis, had never been very clever. Combat, that was what Sophie craved. This skulking bout had her every nerve crackling and her teeth on edge. The fourth compartment contained the mortal remains of an entire family. Their corpses had been placed upon the floor in a grotesque tableau. Father and mother leaning against the outer wall of the compartment side by side. Little boy propped between his father's legs as though they were watching a sporting event together. A babe only a few months old, swathed in bloody linens, lay dead in its mother's arms, face pressed against her cold, exposed breast. Sophie bit her lip and her breath hitched in her chest. All the strength she had received from Eleanor's adoration was torn from her heart and replaced by dread and fear. Real fear, unlike any she had ever felt before. Evil, she thought. This is evil. Most of the creatures she had fought before were simple, stupid, horrid beasts with monstrous intentions. But these two vampires were intelligent. They were toying with her, taunting her, showing her that she was alive only by their sufferance, for their amusement. No, damn them! They won't be so amused when they feel my blade at their throats. The next compartment was her own. The door was still locked. She made no sound, not even to let Yenna and Eleanor know she was beyond the door. Instead, she moved on to the next. There was only one more beyond it. As she reached out to open the door, a new thought occurred to her. What if it was Bertram they wanted, she wondered, and the Slayers in waiting are only a matter of convenience? What if they are already gone? She slid the door open. Bertram lay naked on the floor of the compartment with his chest torn open, and his organs placed around his corpse in a decorative circle. A tiny "oh" escaped Sophie's lips, and she felt as though she could not breathe. For the briefest of instants, the point of her sword drooped and wavered. A hand lunged from beneath the seat to her right, grabbed her ankle, and yanked her leg forward. The Slayer struggled to free herself, lost her balance, and tumbled into the room, falling upon Bertram's corpse. Her left arm sliding into a coil of the man's intestines even as she gripped her sword in her right hand. She wanted to scream, but she dared not. Swift as she was able, Sophie began to turn to draw herself up again. Too late. Spike was there, above her. He launched a hard kick that caught Sophie in the temple, the boot making a solid thunk against her skull. The blow rocked her backward, but Sophie shook it off, rolled back, and leaped to her feet, slick with Bertram's blood. But Spike was gone. She saw the blonde vampire grinning out in the passageway, and the almost ghostly countenance of his lover, Drusilla, behind him. Then Spike slid the compartment door closed, and there came the sudden sound of something hammering against the door. "No!" Sophie screamed, for she understood immediately what they were doing. It was a wedge, perhaps more than one. They were banging wedges into the door to keep it from opening, to keep her trapped inside. The scream that ripped from inside her was akin to that of a savage beast, a primal roar of fury and hatred. Her mind flashed to the abominations she had witnessed in the past few silent minutes, and all the things these creatures had done to the council. But foremost among the images in her mind was one of something that had yet to occur. Yenna and Eleanor, torn apart like poor Bertram, or set up in a mockery of life like the family in compartment 4. "Me!" she screamed at the vampires. "You're supposed to fight me!" "Oh no," Spike whispered from the other side of the door. "We're not allowed to do that. Not yet. Apparently our employer has something else in mind for you." Then they were gone. Sophie stared at the door. Something broke inside her, and she started screaming for Yenna and Eleanor to run, to escape somehow. Spike began to shout right along with her and to pound on the door to the next compartment, where Slayer knew her friends huddled. They had weapons, she knew. Stakes, and perhaps some holy water, but against these two, she knew they had no chance. Her hand felt almost numb as she looked down to see that she still held her sword. Her knuckles were white with the tightness of her grip. With another scream, Sophie lifted the sword and drove it through the door to the compartment. Wood splintered and a tip punched through. She hauled it out, lifted the blade, and brought it down as though it were an axe, using all the strength of the chosen one. "I feel like an artist," Drusilla said airily, feeling the trance that rumbled over the tracks beneath her feet. "I've got all these lovely, bloody pictures in my head. It's absolute bliss to finally get them out, to sculpt them with mortal flesh." With the Slayer locked in a compartment farther along the train car, they stood in the corridor in front of the door behind which her companions awaited her. "You're getting pretty good at it, Drew," Spike told her. "Ought to start your own bloody museum soon. An exhibition of murder." With a shiver of pleasure and a wild song burning in her, she turned to him with a suggestive smile. You always know what to say." Drusilla fell into his arms and licked the dead watcher's blood off his face. "I need a little taste, Spike." He grinned and shook his head. "I'd love to, Poodle, but the Slayer's in the next room, remember? Later, though." "You'll hurt me?" Drew asked expectantly. "Make my flesh burn?" "You'll burn like the sun," Spike promised. With a sudden crack, the point of the Slayer's sword pierced the door to the next compartment. It was removed, and then the girl started to hack at the door with her sword. "We'd best hurry, love," Spike said, frowning. Drusilla smiled sleepily and turned attention to the door in front of them, with the Watcher and the someday Slayer beyond. She could feel them in there, feel their terror. It made her tingle. "They're like kittens, Spike. I can hear them mewling in there, asking for a bowl of milk, for a little more life. I had kittens once. Lots of them. But every time I gave one a bath, it would stop moving." "I remember," Spike told her. "They weren't as slippery as your puppies. Now, shall we? The train is grunting along at a good clip, but if they break the window, they could jump." Ooh, Drusilla said angrily. Bad kitties. She felt her face change then, shifting into the primal visage of the vampire. Drusilla grabbed the door handle and turned it, easily breaking the lock. With a grin, she slid the door open, quivering with anticipation. She felt like dancing. Drusilla smelled the smoke at the precise instant in which she saw the flames. Even as she lunged into the compartment, the Watcher was in motion. The diminutive woman held an enormous torch in her hands, clothing wrapped around a length of wood that had to have been snapped off of a seat or the overhead rack. Matches, Drusilla thought, in the instant in which thought was possible for her. All the weapons they had steeled themselves to face, and she had never even considered matches. With a cry of defiance and terror, the Watcher drove the flaming length of wood into Drusilla's chest. No! Spike screamed behind her. Drusilla blinked in astonishment, expecting her body to explode into a cloud of dust. But the Watcher had missed her heart. Drusilla lived. She lived to suffer in blazing agony. Flames engulfed her clothes, scorching her flesh. Drusilla screamed with the pain, glanced wildly about in search of a way to put out the fire. Then the American girl grabbed her by the arm and yanked her forward. Drusilla's hair was ablaze, her mind reeling, and she lashed out like an animal, trying to free herself. Too late. With a burst of surprising strength, the American propelled her across the compartment and into the window. Drusilla's face, amidst the halo of her blazing hair, hit the glass. In flames, crying out for Spike, she hurled out into the night, hit the ground hard enough to snap bones, and rolled painfully for several yards before coming to a rest. She lay very still. Spike screamed his lover's name. The light from the flames around her disappeared the instant she crashed through the window, and the locomotive rattled on. You stupid cow! Spike roared at the American girl. The Watcher faced him, a stake in her hand. She quivered in fear as he took a snarling step closer to her. The would-be slayer lunged at him with a stake, but he slapped her down, hard enough to split her cheek over the bone, to make her bleed. When he looked back at the Watcher and saw her, wide-eyed and wavering, he blinked in astonishment. Then Spike began to smile. Yeah, he said with a pompous drawl, his lip curled back. This is the big bad you're dealing with now, love. Is it the pain you like? She flinched and drew back a bit. Yana, the American girl whimpered, holding her bleeding face. Do something. You don't know what you're talking about, the Watcher screamed at him, her skin flushing darkly. Don't I? Spike asked, putting all the insinuation he could muster into his voice. I asked if you liked pain, you silly cow, 'cause there's going to be quite a bit of it before I'm through with you. Yana, kill him! The American girl screamed. Kill him now! She's not likely to, are you, love? Spike moved closer, reached out to touch the side of Yenna's face, to push aside a hair that had come loose from her taut braid. The Watcher only flinched and closed her eyes. She quivered. Then she snarled, her eyes popped open, and she lunged at him. Monster! Yenna screamed. Spike batted the stake out of her hand and gripped her by the throat. The American girl started to rise, but he turned to her, the face of the vampire now, and snarled. She fell back onto the seat and wept. Got yourself a little thrill, don't you? Spike whispered. Hate yourself for it. Maybe even want to die for it. But it's there. Another day I might have even indulged your fancy. But you just set fire to the woman I love, so I'm afraid I have very hard feelings on the subject. He dipped his mouth to her throat and sank his fangs into the soft flesh there. Her blood flowed into his mouth and he began to suck. The sword punched through his back from behind, piercing his heart cleanly. Spike arched his back and screamed in pain, then staggered forward, knocking the weakened Watcher down. The sword was yanked out of him hard and he turned to face the Slayer. Now his own knees were weak. He stood with his back to the shattered window, the wind buffeting him, almost strong enough to knock him down. The metal blade would not kill him, but no vampire could take such a wound and not be staggered by it. Spike, if you've killed her, the Slayer began, but could not find any more words. He glanced at the Watcher, unconscious on the floor. Look, he snapped. She set my girlfriend on fire, right? Not exactly the neighborly thing to do. And she's not dead, just down a pint or so. She'll live. You won't, the Slayer vowed, eyes flashing the starlight streaming in through the broken window, sword gleaming with blood. My blood, he thought angrily. I couldn't take your head with you bent over like that, Sophie told him. And before you caught me by surprise. But we're face to face now, vampire. Try me. The wind will take your ashes. She was perfect. Spike was amazed by the girl, captivated by the long blonde hair that swirled behind her with the wind. She was tall and lithe and moved with unnatural grace. A dancer, he decided. Come then, the Slayer barked. And for the first time, he sensed the fear she had been hiding so well. Spike grinned. Another night, he promised. Then he turned, grabbed the jagged edge of the broken window, slicing into his palms, and thrust himself out into darkness. Even as he fell, struck the ground painfully, and rolled over stones and scrub brush, he could hear the Slayer screaming frustration behind him. Another night.